Welcome to Green Dolphin Science. Today on the deep dive, we're zeroing in on something really common. I mean, something many of you listening probably have nearby right now. Plastic building bricks.
That's right. We've been looking at this pretty fascinating study, actually. It was published in the Journal of Hazardous Materials.
And it takes a close look at these beloved toys, really, as a potential source of microplastics and even nanoplastics.
Exactly. A listener, like yourselves, actually pointed us to this paper. It's called Toy Building Bricks as a Potential Source of Microplastics and Nanoplastics.
So our mission today is to really unpack this study, pull out the key findings, and figure out what it means for how you see these everyday objects.
Yeah, what it could mean.
Okay, let's get into it. We're going to look at how these scientists actually did their investigation, what kind of surprising, maybe, details they found about how these tiny plastic bits are created.
Just through regular play, which is the interesting part.
Right, and why this might be something you'd want to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And helping us connect the dots, we have our expert here to give us that bigger picture.
Well, the first thing that jumps out is just how many plastic toys there are. I mean, the global market is huge.
Billions, right?
Yeah, and plastic is just the go-to material. It's tough, it's light, you can make it any color.
But the paper does remind us those same good qualities also bring some known issues. Environmental concerns, health considerations.
Right. Things like potentially problematic chemicals in some plastics, not all, of course. And the fact they're often tricky to recycle, they end up in landfills a lot.
And this study adds, well, another layer to that, doesn't it? A less obvious one, maybe?
Definitely. It focuses specifically on these building bricks, possibly shedding microplastics. Those are particles under 5 millimeters and even tinier nanoplastics. We're talking smaller than 1,000 nanometers.
Just from being played with.
That's what they investigated, just the act of playing.
Wow. Now, the study intro also mentions potential health effects of these tiny plastics, right?
It does touch on that. It notes they've been found in human tissues, and some lab studies, often in animals, suggest links to things like oxidative stress, inflammation.
Even potential cardiovascular issues mentioned.
In some models, yes, it's still an area of active research, but it underlines why figuring out the sources, like potentially these toys, is pretty important.
Okay, so how do they actually test this? How do you simulate play scientifically?
Well, they tried to mimic typical use. They got 50 standard building bricks, bought pretty recently in 2022.
Okay.
And they put them through 10 cycles. Basically assembling them and then taking them apart again.
10 times.
Oh.
Simulate that kind of regular wear and tear.
Exactly. What happens over time with normal play?
So they did the playing part. How did they see what was happening on such a tiny scale? Because we're talking microscopic here.
Right. For that, they needed a really powerful tool. They used what's called a scanning electron microscope, or SEM.
Yeah.
Okay. Think of it like a super, super magnifying glass. It lets you see incredibly fine details on a surface, down to the micro and even nano level.
And what did the SEM images show after those 10 cycles?
Well, the visual evidence was pretty striking. They saw clear signs of micro and nano-sized particles forming.
Where exactly on the bricks?
In the spots you'd expect friction, really. At the very tips of the studs, the little bumps.
Yeah.
Along the sides of the stud poles, too. And on the main flat base surface, where scratching happens when you connect and disconnect them.
Okay, all the contact points.
And even inside the anti-stud, that's the receptacle part on the bottom where the studs click in, where was happening there, too.
That makes sense intuitively.
Yeah.
Did they compare these played-with bricks to new ones?
Oh, yeah, absolutely crucial comparison. They looked at brand new, untouched bricks with the SEM as well.
Big difference.
Big difference. The new bricks had far fewer particles on them, and the few particles they did see looked more like leftovers from manufacturing, residue.
Not the kind of debris generated by the simulated play itself.
Exactly. The play cycles clearly generated new particles.
Okay, so they could see them. But how do you count something that small and numerous? How do they estimate the quantity?
Right, that's the next step. They used image analysis software, something called ImageJ.
ImageJ.
Okay. It basically lets you take those SM images and use computer algorithms to automatically identify and count the particles.
Like a digital census for microdebris.
Yeah.
So what were the numbers like? Are we talking a few particles or?
Quite a bit more than a few. The estimate was for every square millimeter of brick surface.
Just 1 square millimeter.
Yeah, per square millimeter, they estimated thousands of microplastics, and get this, hundreds of thousands of nanoplastics were generated.
Hundreds of thousands after just 10 cycles.
After those 10 cycles, yeah. Now, think about how many square millimeters are on even one brick, let alone a whole collection.
Wow. That adds up incredibly fast.
Yeah.
It sounds like a really huge number of particles potentially being released.
It does sound substantial.
But the paper qualified this a bit, didn't it? Saying the exact number could vary.
Absolutely. They were careful to point that out. Several things could influence the actual amount.
Like what?
Well, how a child plays, for instance. Are they really jamming them together or being gentle? That makes a difference.
Sure.
The age of the bricks, too. Older, maybe already worn bricks might shed differently. Even slight variations in how the bricks were made could matter.
And the counting method itself isn't perfect, I suppose.
No method is. There are limitations, especially with really tiny, irregularly shaped particles. Getting the size exactly right, distinguishing nano from micro sometimes. It's challenging.
Right. These aren't neat little spheres they're counting. Okay, so they saw them, they counted them. How did they confirm they were actually plastic and not just, dust or something else?
Good question. That's where the chemical analysis techniques come in. First, they use something called EDX, Energy Dispersive X-ray Spectroscopy.
EDX. Okay, what does that do?
It basically tells you what elements are present in a sample. In the particles, they found strong signals for carbon and oxygen.
Which you'd expect in plastic.
Yeah.
It's organic.
Exactly. That strongly suggested the particles were organic, consistent with plastic. Interestingly, they also saw a stronger nitrogen signal in some of the bigger particles.
And did they pinpoint the exact type of plastic?
Yes. For that, they turned to another technique, Raman spectroscopy.
Raman. I've heard of that. It identifies molecules.
Precisely. It gives you a sort of molecular fingerprint. They used it on the original mother bricks to figure out what plastic they were actually made of.
But the paper mentioned something about the bright colors being a problem.
Yeah, that's a common issue with Raman on consumer products. The pigments, the dyes that make the bricks bright red or blue or whatever.
They interfere with the signal.
They can, yeah. They can overwhelm the signal from the actual plastic itself, so the researchers had to be selective.
How so?
They focused their detailed Raman analysis on specific colors that gave clear signals. They mentioned dark gray and implicitly a lighter color, probably white or light gray based on the figures.
Okay, so they picked colors where they could get a cleaner read on the plastic underneath. Smart. And what plastics did they find?
To make sense of the Raman data, which can be complex, they use a statistical method called PCA principal component analysis.
PCA.
It helps find patterns. They compared the brick spectra to known reference spectra for common plastics.
Yeah, it's like, what matched?
They found strong correlations with two main types. First, ABS acrylonitrile butadiene styrene. That had a correlation value of 0.77.
ABS is very common in toys, isn't it?
Very common. And the other was polycarbonate, which had an even stronger correlation, 0.96.
Okay, so the bricks were ABS and polycarbonate.
10.
Now, how did they connect that back to the tiny particles they saw? Did they use Raman on the particles too?
Yes, but in a more advanced way, they used Raman imaging, specifically confocal Raman microscopy.
Raman imaging, so making pictures with Raman data.
Essentially, yes. It lets you map the chemical composition across a surface. You can basically see where specific molecules are located. And the confocal part helps focus on the surface and reduce background noise from the bulk brick underneath.
Very cool. So they could see the distribution of the plastic particles.
Exactly. They mapped the characteristic Raman peaks for the plastics they'd identified. They showed detailed examples using polycarbonate and created images showing exactly where these microplastic fragments were sitting on the brick surface.
And could this technique see the really tiny nanoplastics too?
That was trickier. For the nanoplastics, they again used that PCA statistical method on the Raman spectral data.
To kind of boost the signal.
Right, to enhance the signal-to-noise ratio and pull out the subtle spectral signatures of even the smaller nanoparticles that might otherwise get lost.
So the bottom line was...
The bottom line was confirmation. They confirmed that a significant chunk of that debris they saw being generated during play was indeed made up of both microplastics and nanoplastics. And importantly, it was the same material as the bricks themselves, ABS and polycarbonate.
Wow. Okay, so just playing with these common toys creates potentially large amounts of microscopic and nanoscopic plastic particles made of ABS and polycarbonate. What are the big takeaways here? Why should you, listening at home, be paying attention to this?
Well, I think the main point of concern highlighted is the sheer quantity. hundreds of thousands of nano per square millimeter after relatively little simulated play.
And the connection to children, obviously.
Yes, these are primarily children's toys, so the potential pathway for exposure is quite direct. Hand-to-mouth contact is very common in young kids.
Or chewing on the bricks, which definitely happens.
Or even swallowing smaller fragments, potentially. Inhalation is also mentioned as a possibility if particles become airborne, though this study focused on surface particles.
It does give you pause. So from a practical standpoint, what does this suggest for parents or caregivers?
This study doesn't offer direct advice, but it implies that maybe some caution or supervision could be warranted, especially if toys are showing clear signs of wear scratches, scuffs, dents.
Those worn areas might be shedding more particles.
That's the implication. Plus, the paper briefly notes that degraded plastic surfaces might also leach additives more easily, which is another potential concern.
Right. And what about the manufacturers and the regulators? What's their role here?
The researchers suggest that manufacturers should probably be looking into this, how to make toys more resistant to this kind of wear and particle generation.
Improving durability.
Yeah. And on the regulatory side, they point out that rules specifically about microplastic release from toys are, well, pretty much non-existent right now. This kind of research could help inform whether such regulations are needed.
It feels like this study is really just scratching the surface, though. The researchers themselves said it's preliminary, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. They stress that this is an initial investigation. More work is definitely needed.
What kind of further work?
Well, seeing if the results are reproducible with different types of bricks under different play conditions, like kids playing more forcefully or for much longer periods.
Or different environmental factors, like if the toys are left in the sun.
Exactly. Temperature, humidity, UV light exposure, those could all potentially affect how plastics degrade and shed particles. This study was done under controlled lab conditions.
And you mentioned earlier, this study mostly looked at particles still stuck to the bricks.
Right. That's a key point. It quantified the generation on the surface. The next step is figuring out how much actually gets off the surface and leads to exposure.
How many particles become airborne? How many end up on hands? How often kids play? The actual routes, like inhalation versus ingestion. All that needs more research.
Precisely. Quantifying actual exposure risk is complex.
And we should also remember, I suppose, that these bricks aren't the only source of microplastics indoors, right? Dust is full of them.
True. The researchers acknowledge that. Indoor dust comes from textiles, furniture, lots of sources. But this study specifically isolated and investigated building bricks as a potential contributor to that indoor burden.
And those indoor plastics can eventually get outside, too, contributing to wider pollution.
Yes, through things like ventilation or when old toys are thrown out and break down further in landfills or the environment. It's all interconnected.
So, wrapping this up, what does this all really mean for you, our listener? This deep dive into, well, simple plastic bricks reveals a potential source of micro and nanoplastic exposure that maybe wasn't on many people's radar. It's fairly concerning for kids.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even really common, seemingly harmless items can have these unexpected microscopic consequences.
The scientists' work here gives us a crucial starting point, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. It lays a foundation. And while we absolutely need more research to understand the full picture, the findings do suggest that maybe being a bit more mindful of the condition of plastic toys.
Checking for wear and tear.
Yeah, and maybe encouraging play that's a bit gentler, perhaps. It might be a sensible, low-key precaution.
It really does open up a bigger question, doesn't it? What other everyday things around us might be shedding these tiny particles? And what are the real long-term health effects?
It's a huge area of ongoing research, a really important one. We hope this deep dive has given you some valuable perspective on this specific study and the broader issue.
Thank you for joining us on Green Dolphin Science for this really quite eye-opening exploration. We definitely encourage you to think about these findings and maybe even look into some of the ongoing research on microplastics yourself. There's a lot out there.